Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1952. The heat is the first thing you notice. Not the kind of heat that makes you reach for a fan, the kind that wraps around you the moment you step outside, the kind that sits on your chest and reminds you that you are somewhere far from home, somewhere alive in a way that colder places never quite manage. Richard Feynman has been here for 10 months. He has been teaching physics at the Brazilian Center for Physical Research, and he has been watching something unfold in his classroom that he cannot quite name. Something that bothers him in the way a splinter bothers you, not large enough to stop everything, but impossible to ignore. The students are extraordinary on paper. They arrive on time, they take careful notes, they can recite equations with the confidence of people who have been practicing for years. Ask them for the formula describing the angle of light bending as it passes through a lens. They have it. Ask them for the relationship between electric field and charge distribution. They can write it without hesitation. By every conventional measurement of academic performance, these students are doing well. But Feynman is starting to understand that something is deeply, structurally wrong. And on the last day of his time in Brazil, he stands in front of an auditorium full of scientists, professors, and government officials, the people responsible for science education across the entire country, and he tells them exactly what he found. Not diplomatically, not gently, with the uncomfortable directness of a man who has concluded that being kind about this particular problem is the same thing as being cruel. What he said that afternoon would travel far beyond that room. It would reach classrooms on the other side of the world. It would disturb educators who heard it secondhand. And it would eventually become one of the most honest diagnoses of how education systems can produce students who know everything and understand nothing. But before we get to that room, we need to understand what Feynman was actually seeing in his classroom every day and why it took him months to put his finger on exactly what was wrong. Before we go further, drop your country in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching from? Every time I ask this, the map surprises me. Feynman was not a man who suffered from excessive politeness. He had grown up in far Rockaway, New York, in a household where his father had taught him early that the name of something and the knowledge of something were two entirely different categories. His father used to take him into the woods as a child and point at a bird. He'd say, "You can know that bird's name in 15 languages and still know nothing about the bird. The name is the label. What the bird does, how it feeds, how it moves, why it behaves the way it does in winter versus summer, that's the knowledge." Feynman carried that distinction with him everywhere for the rest of his life. And in Brazil in 1952, it became a diagnostic tool. He started testing it quietly, not in formal exams, in conversation. He'd take a concept the students had clearly studied, something they could define and formula cite without hesitation, and he'd ask them about it sideways. Not what is the index of refraction, but have you ever noticed the way a straw looks bent when you put it in a glass of water? What's happening there? And the students would pause, look uncertain. Some would eventually connect the dots, but many couldn't bridge from the equation they had memorized to the thing sitting on every dinner table in the country. This was not a small gap, this was a chasm. Feynman began to realize that what his students had was not physics. What they had was the vocabulary of physics, the notation, the terminology, the surface layer, without the conceptual architecture underneath. They had learned to speak the language without ever being taught what the words meant in the physical world. He compared it later to a society that had learned to read and recite text without understanding what reading was for. The sounds were correct, the syllables were right, but there was no meaning flowing from the symbols to the mind, and no connection flowing back the other way. And this wasn't the students' fault. That's what made it complicated. The students were doing exactly what they had been trained to do. They were doing it well. The problem lived not inside the students, but inside the system that had shaped them, a system that rewarded recall, measured recitation, and treated the ability to reproduce information as equivalent to the ability to understand it. Here is where Feynman's thinking becomes something more than a classroom observation. Because what he identified in Brazil was not unique to Brazil. He had seen versions of it at MIT. He had seen it in conversations with colleagues at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, brilliant people who could execute calculations with extraordinary precision, but who, when you pushed slightly outside the boundary of established procedure, became uncertain in ways that didn't match their technical credentials. He had seen it in textbooks that defined concepts in terms of other concepts, all the way down until you realized you were standing on a circular foundation, nothing underneath, just definitions pointing at each other. The problem he was identifying had a specific shape. It was the difference between knowing and understanding, between possessing a formula and grasping what the formula is actually saying about the physical world, between being able to answer the question and being able to think. And in Brazil in 1952, the gap was large enough and systematic enough that he couldn't let it go unspoken. The final lecture came at the end of his time there. He had been asked to give a closing address, something reflective, something diplomatic, perhaps something celebratory. A good experience in your country, best wishes for the future, keep up the excellent work. Feynman walked to the front of the room and said the opposite. He told the assembled educators that the students of Brazil were not learning science. They were learning the appearance of science. They could recite, but they could not reason. They could reproduce, but they could not apply. He had spent months asking students questions that required them to connect their classroom knowledge to observable reality, and they had failed consistently, not because they were unintelligent, but because no part of their education had ever asked them to do that. He told them that this was not a small problem, that a nation building a scientific culture on this kind of education was constructing something hollow, impressive from a distance, structurally empty up close. The room was not entirely comfortable with this. Some pushed back. Some argued that the students were clearly learning. Look at the exam scores. Look at the recitation. Look at how much material they were covering. Feynman said that was precisely the problem. The scores were measuring the wrong thing. The recitation was evidence of the failure, not the success. Covering material and understanding material were not the same process, and building systems that confused them would produce generation after generation of people who could pass every test and solve almost nothing real. What Feynman was describing in that auditorium in Rio de Janeiro in 1952 was a failure that has a very specific mechanism, and understanding that mechanism matters because it still operates today in classrooms around the world. The mechanism works like this. A student encounters a new concept. Let's say conservation of energy. They read a definition. They see it demonstrated in an example. They practice applying the relevant formula to similar examples. They are tested on those examples. They score well, they move on. At every stage of this process, the student is being asked to do one thing: recognize the pattern and reproduce the correct response. They are never asked to explain why the principle holds. They are never asked to derive it from something more fundamental. They are never asked to apply it in a context that doesn't look like the examples they studied. They are never asked to connect it to something they can see or touch or observe with their own hands. The result is that the concept enters memory as a kind of sophisticated lookup table. Given this type of problem, retrieve this formula. Given this type of question, produce this type of answer. It works efficiently inside the system that created it. Outside that system, in the physical world, in novel situations, in contexts that require actual reasoning, it fails immediately. Feynman called this knowing the name of something rather than knowing something. His father had taught him the distinction in the woods outside New York. He spent his career trying to teach it to everyone else. The technique he used to fight this in his own thinking was disarmingly simple and genuinely difficult. Before he considered any concept fully understood, he required himself to explain it without the vocabulary of the field. No jargon, no technical shorthand, no equations used as a substitute for comprehension. Just plain language, the kind a curious person with no background in physics could follow. If he got stuck, if the explanation broke down at some point, and he found himself reaching for a technical term because the plain language version wasn't coming, that was his signal. That was the location of the gap. Not something to paper over, not something to accept, but something to go back and fix. This is harder than it sounds, much harder, because jargon is comfortable, technical language exists partly for precision, but it also exists as a kind of camouflage. You can hide behind it, you can say something that sounds complete and rigorous and internally consistent while concealing from both yourself and your audience that you haven't quite worked out what it actually means. Jargon is the vocabulary of apparent understanding. Plain language is the test of real understanding. Feynman applied this test relentlessly to himself as much as to anyone else. He prepared lectures by imagining a student who knew nothing and asking whether he could build the concept from the ground up in a way that made sense at every single step. When it didn't make sense, he hadn't found a teaching problem, he'd found a comprehension problem, his own. He also refused to build knowledge on memory alone. Where most physicists kept a mental library of equations to retrieve when needed, Feynman would regularly derive equations from scratch, starting from the most basic physical principles and rebuilding upward. This took longer. It was frequently inconvenient, but it meant that he never held an equation he didn't understand, because the act of derivation forced understanding at every step. You cannot derive something you don't understand. You can only memorize it. This is the distinction that his Brazilian students had never been offered. They had been handed equations as conclusions, tools to use, patterns to apply, without ever being walked through the reasoning that produced them. And when Feynman handed them a situation where the tool didn't quite apply, they had no foundation to work from. They were standing on a floor they had never seen built. There is a kind of education that produces people who are very impressive in familiar situations and genuinely helpless in unfamiliar ones. Feynman spent his entire career trying to understand why, and his time in Brazil gave him the clearest example he ever encountered. It gave him language for something he had sensed, but not yet fully articulated, that the greatest enemy of real understanding is the illusion of understanding, the feeling of knowing that arrives when you can repeat something correctly, even though repetition and comprehension are not the same movement of mind. The students he taught in Brazil were not failures. They were the products of a system that had taught them to succeed at the wrong thing. And the people running that system were not villains. They were educators measuring what they could measure, rewarding what they could reward, optimizing for visible performance, because visible performance is what systems can track. Real understanding is harder to measure. It shows up in strange places at unexpected moments, when someone encounters a problem that looks nothing like anything they've studied and finds to their own surprise that they can reason their way through it anyway. That's what Feynman was trying to build. Not students who could recall, students who could think. He left Brazil at the end of 1952. He had made his case. He had been direct in a way that some in that auditorium found uncomfortable and some found clarifying. He went back to Caltech and kept doing what he always did, teaching, thinking, playing with ideas, deriving things from scratch, explaining complex concepts in plain language until the explanation either held or revealed the gap it was hiding. The lesson from Rio was not really about Brazil. It was about what happens when we confuse the map for the territory, the label for the thing, the name of the bird for the knowledge of the bird. It was about the gap between performance and comprehension, and how easy it is to build entire educational systems inside that gap without ever noticing it's there. Feynman noticed, and he spent the rest of his life trying to show people the difference. Drop your country or state in the comments. Let's see where this community actually reaches. And if this kind of content matters to you, subscribe. Most of you are watching without subscribing, and your engagement is genuinely how these stories find new people. Let's keep building something worth watching. They truly don't make thinkers like Feynman anymore.